All right, I guess I'll get started. I see there's a few still hardcore Ignite people hanging out here. I don't know about you guys, but I was double fisting cappuccinos before I came in here. It's pretty wild, but thanks for joining us. You're in the Monitoring Targeted Attacks session. My name is David Weston. I am the group manager for the Security Research Group, malware analysis, data scientists, basically security professionals and researchers who power the threat intelligence and a lot of the detection logic that's in our Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection product. So I'm going to kind of peel back the onion today, show you behind the curtain how we develop detections, how we track targeted attack groups globally through the Microsoft Security Intelligence Graph, and kind of give you details of how we kind of make the sausage that goes into the Advanced Threat Protection product. So the name of the research team that powers ATP is called the Hunter team. And that's for obvious reasons. We kind of track those predatory groups across the globe. And so we're constantly hunting for signals for either new advanced adversaries or attackers, or we're simply tracking and keeping details and intelligence up to date on some of the groups that we already track inside of the product. And so what does that mean? Well, obviously, we look at information, data, malicious file samples, whether those are documents with exploits in them, whether they're phishing URLs, new attack tools for doing things like dumping credentials, or malware or implants used by adversaries in the Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection client. But we have a much larger surface area than that as Microsoft. And I think that's actually one of the key competitive advantages that's important to understand as a customer is the breadth of optics that Microsoft has is essentially unparalleled out there. So my team on a daily basis is able to query 500 million telemetry reports coming from Defender clients across the globe. And that means if a new file is downloaded in one part of the globe, and it matches a set of characteristics, properties, machine learning algorithms, anomaly detection across the globe, we'll get a signal back on that. We can often request that file as long as the customer agrees to send it back to us, and that'll flow into a very large dynamic analysis system on our back end. And we pull upwards of 1 million files per day and do this detailed analysis. This automated analysis will pull out very useful technical details for us. For example, what APIs is that file calling? What URLs or IPs is it talking to? And other characteristics, what part of the globe it was found in. And so we use that information to sort of curate and identify unique groups of attackers. So if all of a sudden a particular industry vertical is being targeted, let's say in Asia, we are able to start to get those signals about that and start to curate that into a narrative or an identification of a particular group. And so that information is eventually rolled back into, often very quickly, into the ATP product. So that can manifest as what we call IOAs, or indicators of attack. So I'll give you a very clear example. For example, WD-ATP is able to detect credential dumping for binaries that, say, modify the LSASS process, the process that holds your credentials. And so we have a very generic set of capabilities for monitoring tampering against the LSASS process, and we will track that back. On top of that, we layer what we call threat intelligence. And what I mean by threat intelligence is essentially identifying not only the attack itself generically, but likely what the group who's actually perpetrating that attack, say on your a particular customer's network, and what their motivations are. So a lot of that work on a daily basis is simply developing those detections and then building out the background and the context so the customer understands exactly the adversary in the network, what their goals are, and eventually the primary goal is to help identify a defense strategy there. So I mentioned the Defender clients. Another interesting capability that my team and the product has itself to curate intelligence is every month when a Windows update is shipped to one of our customers, 1.2 billion and counting, we're able to actually push out signatures that can match particular implants again. So if we're interested in globally how large a targeted attack campaign is, we can reach out and touch 1.2 billion machines, look at what binary might match some characteristics that we're interested in, again, command and control information, all sorts of metadata about attacks, and that gives us incredible visibility. On top of that, we can leverage other parts of the Microsoft service story. So we have a very good view of end-to-end attacks as they traverse through our email system. So we have spam traps in our, say, Hotmail, Outlook.com, or even O365 in some cases. We can have visibility into threats that are being emailed. We can then stitch that together with URL information that we get through our smart screen telemetry or our localized application reputation from executable downloads in one of our browsers like Microsoft Edge and IE. And then we can even stitch that back to, say, command and control information back to the Azure cloud. So when you look at sort of the end-to-end sort of stages of an attack, Microsoft is incredibly well positioned at each of those stages to collect the maximum amount of data and visibility into that. And our goal in Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection is to manifest that data in a very simplified form for customers and then apply it to the types of threats that we're seeing on their network. Additionally, my team has a lot of background in some interesting spaces. So another competitive advantage that I see Microsoft having in the advanced threat protection space is we are not only very skilled reverse engineers and malware analysts, but a lot of background in the operating system itself. So frankly, a lot of the world's targeted attacks end up on Windows machines. I think most of us in here know that. And so having expertise and having the ability to reach out and touch the person who's designing the kernel, the person who's designed Kerberos and knows pass the hash attacks very well, or the person who designed another component that's being attacked is an incredible value. It means that our analysts have a very short loop between seeing an attack, understanding exactly how it's manifesting on a system, and ultimately what the best defense is for that. So we're able to collaborate. In fact, my team sits in the same building as most of the folks who are building the security infrastructure at the operating system level, and so there's a lot of exchange of information back and forth. And the end is that ends up in manifesting itself in advanced threat protection. So the process, it looks like something like this for developing intelligence that goes there. The first thing we're goaled with is constantly discovering new attackers. You as the customers are looking for us when you're signing up for Defender ATP to keep you abreast of new attacks as they happen. And so our daily process is tapping into that intelligence security graph and curating new signals through machine learning, dynamic analysis, signatures, all sorts of different methods which are constantly evolving. Once we've identified either something new or novel, we're going to go ahead and investigate that and start to build up and curate our intelligence. So what are the C2s associated with this attack? What are the file names or so-called lures that this particular adversary is using? What do they seem to be interested in? What does the victimology of this campaign look like? When did it start and stop? All those crucial questions that as a customer, if you're being attacked by one of these adversaries, you're going to want to know to help protect your network and your enterprise. Additionally, as soon as we have something that we think is actionable and accurate, and we spend a lot of time on that and pride ourselves in making sure that this intelligence is accurate, we push it through into the Windows Defender ATP portal. And I'm going to show you in a few slides what that looks like, but that could mean things like very generic detection for the techniques that the attackers are using. That's the gold standard because it means even if they say shift up a file name or shift what the file looks like from a content level, we can still detect them based on the invariance of essentially why they're doing the attack. So the way to think about that is our goal is always to get as close as we can to the DNA of the attack and then layer up from there. Additionally, we will push out things like IP addresses, domain names, file names, hashes of files, all of those things that you can use in your network and are automatically manifested in the ATP portal to identify not only the attack is happening, but the actor that we're attributing it to or the actor that we think is associated with that. Often the motive of the attack is just as important for defense as understanding that the attack's been detected in the first place. Because depending on the motivation of the attacker, you need to understand if this is going to be a sustained attack. Are there other folks in your industry verticals that you need to collaborate with and talk to? Do you need to involve law enforcement? Do you need to involve incident response? All of those response actions can be driven by accurate threat intelligence. Once it's in the portal, we often make an attempt to talk to victims globally. So we want to share as much information as we can with them. We want to reach out and talk to them about the best way to do incident response or simply tell folks who maybe not even Microsoft customers to help clean up the attack and respond to it. Our goal is to protect the sort of global customer base and the global user base of computer users. And so we want to make sure that we're using our intelligence as much as we can to disrupt adversaries. And then finally, once we have enough information, let's say this is a new actor that, it may take us a few months to build up an entire report or a dossier, then we're going to publish that in various forms. Probably most of you are familiar with our security intelligence report that Microsoft publishes annually. If you're not, I would take a look at that. We often publish blogs on our security sites. And so one of the goals of my team is to make sure that we're disseminating this information to the community of defenders out there so that we can work on that information. Additionally, I will call out that we work very closely with other groups inside of Microsoft. So there's an awesome group of threat intelligence folks called Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center that works on other products. So there's a lot of collaboration at Microsoft and at the industry level. So currently in the product today, the way that intelligence manifests itself is when you have a detection on your network that's identified as uniquely associated with a threat actor, we call that out. So the screenshot I took here is a website that's associated with an actor we call Krypton. Now, we use various aliases to identify a connected group of attacks, and currently our sort of index into that is the chemical element table. And so Krypton is a uniquely identified attack group that is in the 15 or so actors that we're tracking today that are there on the left-hand side. And so in this particular alert, the user has a user on a network has visited a URL that we know is associated with this actor. So we've been able to validate and identify that that's distributing an attack. And so we manifest as much information as we can. Once the user clicks on that alert in the portal, we identify the history of this attacker, when Microsoft first became aware of them, the types of traits or tactics, techniques, and procedures associated with the actor, various defensive actions that might even take place off the endpoint, so at the network level or the proxy level. As much information as we can that we think will help customers defend themselves is manifested in the portal. In addition, not only do we have sort of the quick summary of information there, for every alert that's associated with an actor that we track, we actually have a very detailed report, sometimes 30 or 40 pages, with very, very low-level technical details that's available in the portal. So really, as deep as you want to go, we've got various stages of information there. And that's how this content and the work that my team does manifests itself in the product. So one of the things we, as I said in the beginning of the talk, is we want to kind of show you how we would investigate an attack or a campaign. And so we want to deep dive into an adversary that we call Strontium. Strontium is a particularly interesting actor, probably one of the most active globally, at least that Microsoft is aware of. We know that they've been operating with our intelligence at least from 2007, and there are a lot of folks in the industry who have believed that that started even earlier. One of the reasons they're so high on our radar, both as a company and as a product, is they often leverage zero-day vulnerabilities. So very capable actor, highly technical, often using newly weaponized vulnerabilities at the start of a new campaign. And so we watch them closely. In addition, they have a very capable set of what we call implants or tools once they're able to use something like a zero-day exploit or phished credentials to get access to a network. So they've got tools that will jump air-gap networks through USB. They've got tools that will do silent credential dumping. They've got tools that will bind VPN connections and tunnels into enterprise networks of victims. So they've got a tool in the toolbox for nearly any situation once they've got control of a network. They have a high focus on government, military, and financial verticals, but we see them spread out probably based on various intelligence priorities that they're gathering. And currently, most of the victims that we see are in the EU and Central Asia, although we do see them operating in the United States as well. So at the start of any investigation, we have a final goal to flesh out what we call the kill chain. And the kill chain is just sort of a fancy term for saying all of the stages of an attack. So the sort of standardized taxonomy for talking about the stages of attack are as follows. So we have what's called the reconnaissance stage. And in the reconnaissance stage, the attacker might have set up a goal. I would like to compromise company X, or I would like to compromise targets in vertical X. And the first thing that the attacker needs to do is gather reconnaissance. What are the IP space of the intended victim? What are those email addresses? Who in the organization should be targeted? You know, getting access to Joe from janitorial is very different than getting access to the CTO who might have the intellectual property or patentable information available. Once the reconnaissance stage is done, the attackers will usually weaponize, or what we call tooling up. So they'll decide, is this company using two-factor authentication that's going to prevent phishing? What kinds of applications did we find in the reconnaissance stage that we might be able to go and build an exploit for? Sometimes there's commerce involved, so we know a lot of these targeted attack groups can actually reach out and purchase zero-day exploits depending on what the reconnaissance stage called for. So they're essentially going to figure out the plan of initial entry in an attack. From that point, we have what's called the delivery stage. And the delivery stage is the act of actually pushing out the initial attacks. And this is usually signals the start of what we call a campaign. So a lot of these targeted attack groups will be very active for a short period of time. Maybe they accomplish their goals and get the information they want from victims, and then they'll die down. Sometimes that oscillation can be associated with, you know, a lot of the defenders kind of coming together to disrupt the attack. Sometimes it's associated with the patching of a zero-day. But we see these oscillations in activity, and we usually group them together into a unit we call a campaign. And so that delivery is something we will monitor through website traffic, through email attachments, through executable downloads, things like that. The exploitation phase is the actual phase in which the action happens. So action on endpoints, actions on servers, the actual installation of the implant that will give the attacker the foothold in the network. And that's obviously very visible in something like Defender ATP, where we've got these advanced behavioral analytics, and we're able to see what's going on in the endpoint. The next stage, the attacker, especially advanced attackers, they want to get persistent access to a network. So the way that I describe cyber capabilities of a lot of these actors is they want it to work just like a satellite. They want to sit there and be very silent and just watch everything happening. So one of the primary goals as soon as you get a foothold into a target network from these attacker groups is they want to make sure that they can maintain persistent access. Sometimes that's through a piece of malware. Sometimes it doesn't involve malware at all. It might just be taking credentials that will not arise suspicion and logging into a network. Sometimes we even see attackers minting their own VPN certificates or client certificates for a particular enterprise and logging in just like any other employee would. Once that implant is there, they want to maintain persistent connections, and we call that the CNC, or the command and control phase. And that can involve using DNS tunneling, using HTTP or other creative mechanisms to basically hide themselves in the noise of an average network, making sure that they don't arouse any suspicion as they access their implants, et cetera. And then finally is the end goal, which is oftentimes data exfiltration. So whether that's an email spool from an Exchange server or some other email server, documents, source code, you name it. But our primary goal as threat intelligence analysts is to figure out the details for each one of these stages for a particular adversary and make sure that we're covering and detecting each stage for our customers. And the reason we want to do that is detection in depth is very powerful. We know any one of these stages the attackers might switch up, they might re-encrypt their malware, they might change their IPs. So if we have coverage at each stage, we believe we'll be able to durably protect it when it touches a new network. And so that's our ultimate goal, is to get 100% coverage across this chain. So in the Strontium case, we have very good knowledge of the first section here, of the first couple of stages. And so, as I said, Strontium often comes on our radar when a new campaign starts. So we track them, we understand a lot of the signals or specific characteristics of the group. So when they're back at it, you know, we're there right away watching them. And so one of the characteristics that we see with Strontium specifically is that they really like to spearfish. And what I mean by spearfishing is after they've done their reconnaissance stage, they will craft an email for a very specific person with a specific function that may have a document attachment containing something like a document zero-day exploit that will install an implant on whoever is the victim who opens it. They will find a zero-day exploit in something like Oracle's Java or Adobe Flash that will allow them to do something similar just by clicking a link. So we see that frequently. We also see just standard kind of phishing emails. And what's interesting is they share a lot of characteristics with very common cyber criminals. So they're not above simply sending out fake PayPal emails or things like that. Even though they're a very advanced adversary, they use very simple tactics as long as it works. And then we also see some very tailored things. So if an organization, often organizations in Europe may be standardized on Firefox for one reason or another, we see them using malicious Firefox extensions to target that organization. So they're their tradecraft is very well honed and very mature, and so we see them capable of adapting their kind of social engineering to whether or not that organization commonly uses various email services, things like that. So they're very good at adapting at this stage. So here is just a simple word cloud of some of the, oops, I think I went too fast. There we go. So here's a word cloud that gives you some of the idea of the ways that Strontium hides. And so in order to both distribute these spear phishing emails as well as create command and control, the Strontium adversary has a very large number of basically domains. And there's two characteristics of these domains. The first is at the delivery stage, they want to create something that looks very similar to a benign or well-trusted site. So for example, if they're targeting an adversary who's very familiar or uses Yahoo email, then they will register a domain that looks very similar to Yahoo. Maybe it'll be Yahoo 1. And so a cursory inspection or someone who's not very detail-oriented would not even notice that it didn't come from Yahoo, especially when you pair it with a well-themed phishing email. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Additionally, if they're targeting, say, military or diplomatic targets, they'll get even craftier. Maybe there's a conference, like the diplomatic version of Ignite coming up, and they want to target attendees. They will create a DNS or a domain that looks very similar to, say, a military conference, and they'll send out registration emails the same week that you're getting the legitimate ones. So very crafty, and it's an incredibly effective tactic that we see them use very consistently. And so I would say the sort of defining characteristic of this adversary is they never give up, they're very excellent at the recon stage, and they use simple but effective tactics. This is an example of some of the simple spear phishing emails that we see targeting a range of email providers. And so you can see what they've done is make things look very similar to login pages, and they'll send out an email that's requesting a password reset. They will send out privacy alerts and say, it looks like someone's compromised your account. We need you to authenticate to reset your credentials. And they'll use things that look very similar to actual legitimate email resets in order to target folks. And often what we see with the Strontium adversary is if there's a group of folks that they're interested in that have a public email list, they'll harvest that list. So let's say it's a nuclear energy consortium of folks talking about, the latest clean nuclear power restrictions. There's a public email sort of distribution list. We'll see them craft an email for each person in that list and persistently send it. So it's not a one-time thing, it's once a month, twice a month, depending on the cadence. And so, as I said, the defining characteristics is that they're so excellent in this reconnaissance stage that simple tactics work because it's so tailored to the victim, and the victim is not really suspecting it. Here's an example of an actual email a spear phishing email sent by Strontium. The link in red, which says EuroAsiaGlobalNews.com, actually contained a zero-day flash exploit at the time we were aware of it. And this sort of demonstrates what we were talking about in the sense that they sent out a mail that looked like it potentially came from a defense advisor that perhaps this victim knew. It was incredibly timely because the day it was sent, the title of the email was actually something that was very popular in the headlines that day. There is a apparently popular news website called Eurasia Review that had a article title that was nearly identical to the spearphished URL that they created that day, just a few characters off. So you see the bad guy's site is EurasiaGlobalNews.com. The actual legitimate site is Eurasia Review, but the link is nearly the same. And so you could imagine if they send out a few hundred of these, some decent percentage of users are going to click on this, and the end result is they're going to have that first foothold in the network should the user be, susceptible to the exploit. But this is exactly what it looks like in practice, and this is the kind of intelligence that we would immediately gather and push out to our ATP users. So we would know the email address is coming out, say the IP of the mail servers there, certainly the URLs, all of those things within minutes of basically validating that intelligence information. So this is what the actual exploit looks like in action, and this is exactly what we saw on victims' machines. So a very similar website, same kind of campaign. We can see, and this is actually through our Defender client, we can see that unfortunately a victim visited that site. The next thing we see is that there is a executable created from Internet Explorer due to the success of the remote code execution exploit that actually contains a second exploit. And the reason it contains a second exploit is you're probably aware that even our legacy Internet Explorer browser has what we call an application sandbox. So that means once you get code execution in the browser, an attacker still can't accomplish what they want, which is install a backdoor, read documents, dump credentials. They're stuck in this kind of low integrity sandbox. And so the response from attackers has been they now develop two exploits, one to get them into the browser to start, and the second one to attack the kernel to get maximum privileges and then dump the credentials. And that's, you've probably heard a lot at this conference about our virtualization-based solutions that protect CredGuard, et cetera, as well as Application Guard, which is our virtualized sandbox for our inbox browsers in Win 10. Both of those are designed to mitigate this type of attack because it is a very common tactic that we see. Once that kernel mode exploit has been successfully run, the attackers are at system, and they run a version of their backdoor. And then within about a few hours, we see them actually log into that backdoor and start to dump credentials and move laterally through the network. So this is absolutely a real victim timestamp. Obviously, we can't show any of the identifying information, but this is the type of visibility that we get into attacks globally. And we get even additional visibility from the ATP client from an analytics standpoint. But this is the type of information that our analysts would look at daily and stitch together into a new attack. And at the time this was seen, that kernel 0-day was actually never known before. And so we were able to pull it in and fix it. We were the first to discover that. So digging into that a bit, this is a very interesting exploit used in Strontium's case. It was, as I said, it was a 0-day exploit. In this case, it was a heap-based buffer overflow in an audio codec supported by Flash. Interesting to note is that the exploit itself was not capable of bypassing what we call control flow guard. And I gave a talk yesterday about all the various hardening mechanisms that are in Windows 10, specifically the Anniversary Edition. And one of the key features of Windows 8.1 Plus that I called out is we have what's called control flow guard. And control flow guard is a technology that attacks a very common exploit technique called ROP, or return-oriented programming. And so Strontium was actually targeting exclusively Windows 7 users who did not have control flow guard since the exploit was defeated. The technique they were using was defeated by anybody running anything above 7. So that's an interesting thing to note. And then on those Windows 7 machines, there was a second exploit that used a kernel mode 0-day to escape the application sandbox. As I said, that 0-day is in a legacy component in Windows that we call Win32K. Again, this kernel mode 0-day would have been defeated for anyone running Windows 8 Plus through a hardening mitigation we call SMEP, or which essentially prevents kernel mode code from executing userland implants, which is a common technique used here. It's another important piece of information. And the key thing I want folks to kind of internalize in this room is each of the stages of this attack in the ATP context, we would be doing analysis, pushing out information, creating behavioral analytics within minutes or hours of an attack happening. So this is a very constant kind of motion for us on a daily basis. Another attack that we saw Strontium use frequently was a Microsoft Word 0-day. And so what's interesting about Strontium is they seem to have a fairly keen and well-developed kind of exploit development group or source, because what we often see in the case of attack groups is that they have a formula and they sort of keep using it till it works. So many adversaries, if they're very good at, say, hacking Adobe Flash, you'll just see a parade of Flash vulnerabilities from them. Or if they're good at another component, you'll see a parade. One of the defining characteristics and sort of maturity levels of the Strontium group is they seem to have exploits that range the kind of full spectrum of common applications that you would see in an enterprise. So whether that's a word processor, whether, like I said, whether it's Java, et cetera. And that's interesting because it becomes harder to sort of nail them down for a particular vector because they are so agile. In this particular case, they were using a Microsoft Word 0-day. Again, thing I wanted to call out here, if you were running a modern version of Office, so Office 2013 plus, their attack is completely defeated. They use what we call an address space layout randomization, a bypass technique by loading legacy binaries. If you're running Office 2013 plus, even though you're vulnerable to the particular vulnerability, the exploit techniques that were practiced by Strontium were completely defeated by platform issues. And this is a reoccurring theme is often targeting folks that are on sort of lower level platforms, what I would call the lower hanging fruit from a victim standpoint, and just completely ignoring more hardened platforms like Windows 10. I mentioned previously in this same campaign, we also saw in the case where a user was using a non-Internet Explorer browser, something like Firefox, we see them resulting to what we call social engineering tactics. So again, if you were to get one of those spear phishing emails and click the link, if you were running Internet Explorer on Windows 7, they would drop the Flash exploit plus kernel attack as a way to get onto the machine. If the user's user agent was Firefox, instead they would offer up a fake page that presented a offer to install a very nice Firefox XPI extension. And if we clicked yes, the machine is completely controlled. One of the reasons is Firefox doesn't actually have a sandbox, so it runs at kind of full trust level. So if you just make that one click, it's game over. And again, to talk about sort of the gray area between sophisticated attackers and not, this was actually copied line for line from a Metasploit module. So we have kind of a world-class adversary here who's not above basically copying the same tools that an everyday security professional would use. And again, this installed that same backdoor implant. So parade of kind of exploits and vulnerabilities used by Strontium. One thing I wanted to call out is how many of you recall the incident where a computer security company in Italy was hacked and all of their kind of tools were put onto the internet? We call that the hacking team incident. That was the name of the company. Strontium, again, being the sort of opportunists that they were not above just copying and pasting the exploits from this data dump that was available basically to everyone on WikiLeaks, and they immediately jumped on that and started using it to target victims. So again, there's a very interesting spectrum here between they seem to have a very advanced capability, but they're very willing to use PayPal phishing or Metasploit modules or anything else. And what that tells you, this is really a professional group that's about getting the job done, not about any sort of specific techniques. And so this is kind of a history of the exploits we've seen them use, and that's why they're frankly on our radar. Here's an example of towards the tail end of that campaign where we had already patched the kernel mode vulnerability, and we had patched the Flash issue, and we had patched the Word document. So what we saw them doing was additional spear phishing. And if you look at the left-hand side there, which is actual NATO.int, which is an actual official NATO site, and on the right-hand side, you can see in sort of the blue there, natoint.com. And so this was very similar to the email I'd shown you earlier, where they were sending people what looked like official NATO sort of mail notifications with a very slightly different domain name. And if you clicked that, it would immediately forward you to the legitimate NATO site. But if you look at the gold bar there, what do you think is interesting? The official NATO.int is not going to offer you a Java applet, right? In this case, they are. And so what they've done is, if as a user, the experience is you click this natoint.com, you're immediately forwarded to the legitimate NATO site, and all you see is an applet running on your machine. So you never know, really, unless you very closely analyze the network traffic, that you've been sent to an intermediate site and attacked. And that's a little hallmark to these very stealthy techniques. And so we actually noticed this starting to happen immediately after the other campaign. So of course, we were suspicious. And again, we started to look into various endpoint telemetry, and what we could see is users who were going to domains that all pointed to the same IP, because what Strontium will often do is set up, say a virtual machine somewhere in the cloud with a fixed IP, and then they may point hundreds of different domains that are all like natoint.com or very closely related to the victims, and so we can sort of build out that association. And what we saw was victims who were visiting URLs with fully patched Oracle Java were getting implants on their machine. So what does that tell us? Yes, another 0 day in the wild. It actually took us about another 6 months to track that down. It was very difficult to actually pull the file back. They were doing all sorts of delete and things, but we had about a 6 months head start on this kind of tracking this 0 day in this particular case. So I've talked to you sort of quite a bit about the front end of those attacks. Let's talk about what the back ends look like. So once Strontium actually is capable of, or is able to sort of get an initial foothold on a network, as I said previously, they want to install persistent implants. They want a backdoor access. They want constant ability to monitor information on the victim's network. They want to come and go as they please. They want to take information in a very silent way. And so they have a couple of different tools that they can bring to bear to do that. The first is they have a custom keylogger. And why would they want to do that? Well, of course, they are very skilled in using pass the hash and very sort of common lateral movement techniques, but maybe they want to set up credentials for a machine that's not SMB authenticated, maybe a Linux machine, maybe some different machine. They want those credentials, and oftentimes, as you know, users reuse credentials on various different cloud services, so getting access to those credentials through a keylogger is something they'll do. And we'll often see them, once they've controlled the network, they'll install keyloggers on just about every machine on the network. Additionally, and this is kind of surprising to some folks, is once they have an initial foothold, if they think that maybe their malware implant might be noticed, maybe it'll drive network anomalies, they'll instead just install a VPN tunnel. So it's remarkable. We just see them VPN into somebody's network. They just kind of dual home it, and they're coming and going as they please with a persistent network. And sometimes they'll join 5 or 6 or 7 machines on the VPN endpoints, and it's like they have this shadow network on a victim. Pretty scary. Obviously, they have lots of custom tools that do things very similar to pass the hash, Windows credential editor, Mimikatz, very basic things there. We see them used what we call air-gapped exfiltration. So let's say that they are targeting a very sensitive network where sensitive information is kept offline from a network. They do have implants that are capable of moving back and forth across that air gap through removable USB devices or other sort of storage mechanisms. And then finally, a very unique characteristic is if a network is very locked down at the egress point, we've actually seen them use SMTP to send emails outbound that have encoded information. And in some places, we've actually seen on diplomatic networks that the outbound email will be, say, the lead diplomat of that office, because nobody would read his mail, right? So they're sending things kind of outbound, knowing that the security folks at that organization might even be wary of reading kind of the head boss's mail. So they use very kind of sinister tactics in those cases. So this is sort of what it looks like end to end. You would get in this particular campaign, you would get a spearfish, and that could be a credential capture. That could be a browser plus kernel exploit. That could be an XPI exploit in the case of Firefox, or not exploit, rather a malicious XPI extension, or that could be a Java 0 day. Once they've sort of elevated up to that medium level, then depending on the characteristics of the network, what their recon and intelligence tells them, maybe they install a VPN module, keyloggers, credential dumpers, or USB auto-run if there's an air-gap network. And they'll then join back the attacker's network. How many of you are familiar with a sort of open source tool set called Kali Linux? Kali Linux is a very basic tool set, right? This is an example of how, again, the duality between sophisticated and basic. We've actually seen them VPN to networks and then bring up a host called Kali Linux VM. So if you've ever done anything, and everybody knows that that's a very basic thing. It's the default domain name or default host name for Kali Linux is Kali, And so they didn't even bother to obfuscate that they're using Kali Linux, just brought it up and started pen testing the network just like anybody else would. So that is examples of this unfortunate lack of sophistication of some of the victims. If you had a very basic rule like Kali Linux on my network, I should know about, they sort of missed it. And then finally, this is sort of an interesting demonstration of the capabilities that we have to track things down. So when we were breaking down all of our victims and trying to associate things and notify people, one of the things that we thought was interesting was a VM that had all of the implants and exploits a few months before they were used. And so what we think we found here was an attacker VM where the exploit was actually being developed. So we could see very early versions of it. We could see it going iterated through. We could see a couple weeks before the attacks it actually being tested on an IP that we know later on was being manifested. And so we saw all stages of the attack on a single VM, and that gave us a very strong advantage to be able to track these attackers. They actually kept this VM going for quite some time. They were not very sophisticated in hiding their tracks, but we were able to track down a set of IPs that we know were used in those attacks, and that gave us very good optics in this particular campaign. So interesting thing, these folks were not sophisticated enough to disable their antivirus client, or they just didn't care. So they just ran everything with antivirus, and so we got all the detections and were able to sort of track down one of the adversary's machines. And that is actually commonplace. The fact that we've got optics on 1.2 billion machines means we often have the victims and the attacker kind of signal coming into us, and we can use that to stitch together the source of attacks and attribution and et cetera. So again, I think we saw over 600 or so domains used in this attack, so very large and sweeping, hundreds of victims, very big, nasty group here, Strontium. So it is one of the groups that we cover very frequently, and I think our coverage at Microsoft across all of our ATP products is very excellent. So if Strontium is a concern, it's a great place to go. So the conclusion here, and I'll open it up for questions, is Microsoft's intelligence graph and our investment in our strategy as a company is really paying dividends, whether you're using Azure's Security Center, whether you're using Office 365 ATP, which has excellent threat intelligence, or using WD-ATP, or hopefully an integration of all three. We think we have world-class threat intelligence that is the most actionable and comprehensive. And if you're ever in the unfortunate incident of actually being attacked by one of these adversaries, this would come in very handy, the ability to know who else is being targeted, when a campaign started, are they likely to come back, what techniques might they use in the network that I haven't discovered yet. All of those things are critical inputs into what I think it would be a successful incident response. Our Hunter team has a lot of intelligence on the 15 actors we track, and we're constantly looking to add more things. In addition, we have a combination of specific threat intelligence on an attacker, but generic detection capabilities. And so what that means is, even if an attacker was to switch a technique that we were not aware of yet, we still have a generic detection technique that can serve as a backstop and allow us to continue to curate our information. And so we believe the combination of specific alerting on an endpoint and then immediate attribution in intelligence is a powerful construct for users to defend themselves. And so we think WD-ATP is really at the top there as far as actionable threat intelligence. So that's what I have today. Please do consider joining the Windows Insider program. A lot of the latest WD-ATP features are there, as well as a lot of the platform hardening stuff I talked to you about today. An ounce of prevention is worth a lot, especially when it comes to Windows 10. The vast, vast, vast majority of targeted attacks are not capable of penetrating the layered defenses that we have in Windows 10. So this is arguably one of the best things you can do to protect yourself. And if anyone has questions, I'm a little early, so I'm happy to answer them. Sure. So in the cases where that's applicable, where the victim is opted in, and where there's legal rights and privacy rights to do that, we will absolutely collaborate. I mean, our goal is to protect customers, but we also need to abide by privacy and all of the sort of global legal standards. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, and oftentimes what we'll do is work with TAMs or other folks to talk to victims, and we've had a lot of kind of mutual collaboration. I mean, we do the best we can to help all of our customers recover from something. And then the great thing is we're able to take the sort of intelligence that's unfortunately on the victim's network and use that to protect other folks. So it is generally a good story, and we work very closely where we can. I mean, our goal is ultimately to prevent these attacks, but where we can't, we want to follow up with them. Yeah.
So you had said essentially that the attackers denying download of updated pattern files allowed you to key in on their IP address to complete the circle?
So one of the things we were able to do is say they were building exploits and sort of implants that sort of slightly match things we had seen before. And so one of our goals is to kind of cluster things. So we'll take something, maybe a machine learning algorithm will say, this file looks just like this file you told me was bad before. And so it'll alert us to that, and then maybe we'll pull that file and do more introspection. Once we've got that file, we can see, oh, it's connecting to this IP. What other domains maybe are pointing to that IP, or what other machines are talking there? And so we start from one fragment of information, and we kind of build it out into this large graph. So that term's intelligence security graph is actually true. The way we think about information is each piece of information is a node, and each piece of like correlating information to IP that shows that this executable is connected to this backend site, those are the edges in the graph. So a lot of what we do is actually building out these graphs and then traversing them to create information and share it with users. Great. Well, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm up here, or you can contact me or Heike afterwards. Thank you very much.